The Federal Reserve took action yesterday, so let's talk about that and get an idea what the Fed did, what it's going to do, and in general, the Fed in general, what they're supposed to do. Yesterday, they raised the federal funds rate by a quarter percentage point. This was expected. It's not a surprise. It was already factored into the market. What's more important is the Fed notes what their projections are for the future. And it seems like there's good news around the corner. Inflation is still an issue. It's still elevated, but according to Chairman Powell, it seems in check, which means it may start coming down, and better yet, interest rates might be coming down. The Fed is raising these rates. They've been raising them since they started this program last year. The federal funds rate is at 4.75%. They've raised the federal funds rate by 4.5% since then to try to stem inflation that they've created, in my opinion. So why is this important? Where the concern this past year was inflation, the concern was interest rates rising, but it seems like with this latest action, with the anticipation the Fed says they may be done with these rates. These ongoing increases may stop. He said at most maybe two more. Some may even predict even one more increase. Having said all that, that may give leeway to rates to come down, which is good news. But let's talk about the Fed in general. What is the Federal Reserve? People talk about it as second nature, but the Federal Reserve is technically independent of the federal government. So who owns the Fed? Well, who works for the Fed? Where does the Fed get all this money, right? That's a whole nother rabbit hole to go down, so we won't go into that. But these views that I'm expressing are mine and mine only. So the Fed's inception, what it was meant to do is to control the money supply in basically inflation through monetary policy. Inflation, what people realize, is one of the worst things can destroy an economy. Inflation is a pay cut for all of us. It's the cost of goods and services go up, thus the purchasing power of the money we make decreases. So inflation is a serious issue. Historically, there's been studies inflation has caused, always precedes wars. Inflation has brought down empires. So it's something that's should be taken very, very seriously. So the Fed was created to try and control that through the money supply, meaning how much money is in the economy. Too much money in the economy is inflationary. Thus, if you saw what happened during the lockdown, when everything was locked down, there was almost no business going on. The Fed injected over $5 trillion into the US economy. That's a lot of extra money, and the result was inflation. But that was a unique time that we lived through. Having said all that, if you look at the history of the Fed, as far as how long I've been watching it, I've mentioned before, in the 80s and 90s, I was a trader at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, which in no way whatsoever makes me an expert in anything, but just I do have an opinion. And I remember as the Fed became more and more important, the markets would go away from traditional economic indicators and just focus on what the Fed was doing. And I realized the Fed became like a babysitter, a parent, but not a very good parent in my opinion. You know, as I have kids, when I discipline my kids, I don't reward bad behavior. I try to correct that by punishments, but punishments don't have to be harsh, but show that there's consequences for those actions. The example I give back in 1999, 2000, that's when the internet was new and it was all the rage and everything was going to be done on the internet, everything. You wouldn't have to do anything. Well, we're almost there now, but back then, you had companies sprouting up that were just getting investments and the stock prices were going through the roof, but these companies were losing money. A lot of these companies don't exist anymore. They crashed, and it was called the mini .com crash is what it was called. That's called a recession. What did the Fed do? Of all people, Alan Greenspan. This is when I realized Alan Greenspan, if you read his early works back in the 50s and 60s, was a strict monetarist, but the actions he took as Fed chairman would be contrary to everything he actually believed in. So then it hit me that the Fed's become more political than anything else. So after that .com crash, I should say, what did the Fed do? They started pumping money into the economy, meaning, okay, something's bad, we're going to make sure it's not, we're going to fix this. Well, a recession's not necessarily a bad thing. What does a recession do? It cleans out the garbage. And then you clean out, you get leaner, stronger, and move forward and learn from those mistakes. But if there is no consequences for bad actions, if you can get bailed out by the Fed or the government on a regular occasion, then it perpetuates itself. So the Fed stepped into its role now, it seems to be to save us from ourselves or save capitalism or what have you, a free market from itself, rather than let it clean out the bad things and become more efficient. Again, just my opinion. So in this past year with this aggressive rate hikes that we saw, I would venture to say the Fed became a little too aggressive, was watching policies. You know, when you get these economic indicators that come out, the final numbers, it's past numbers, 2 or 3 months, and the Fed sometimes seem to be acting on the past rather than the projecting on the future. In a nutshell, as I mentioned, the Fed's goal is to maintain a stable economy, and I think in these past few years they've struggled a bit. They've been behind the curve, and again, but it seems like now that there's, with a lot of pressure, they've seen that now's the time that they're going to slow down on these rate hikes. Now's the time that we might see a contraction, might see some type of a recession, which will bring down inflation somewhat and interest rates as a whole, which could be a good thing for the economy in the long run. So that's my take on the Federal Reserve, my opinion only, but the bigger picture, the good news is there's light at the end of the tunnel. We could see interest rates coming down. Have a great day, everyone. God bless.